The Pacific at night was a thing of quiet terror, endless, black, and alive with unseen movement beneath its surface. In June 1944, the ocean was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a listening post, and the hunters of the deep were being hunted. Somewhere in those waters, between the Caroline Islands and the Philippine Sea, a Japanese submarine known only to her crew as I-52 slipped silently through the ink-dark waves. Her diesel engines throbbed like the heartbeat of a dying empire. To the men aboard her, the war had shifted beyond their reach. The Pacific, once a vast refuge where submarines roamed free, now belonged to the Americans. The sky above bristled with long-range patrol aircraft. The seas were lined with radar-equipped destroyers, and the air itself carried an invisible weapon, sonar buoys that listened, tracked, and whispered death to anything metallic below. The I-52 was no ordinary submarine. She was a cargo boat of secrets, an underwater freighter tasked with crossing half the globe to trade with a distant ally equally desperate, Nazi Germany. In her narrow steel belly, she carried 2 tons of gold bullion for payment, drawings of Japanese jet engines, and a cargo of raw materials the Reich could barely afford to lose: tungsten, rubber, molybdenum. In return, she was to bring back radar sets, anti-aircraft guns, and the miracle weapons Germany promised could still turn the tide of war. Her mission was called Yanagi, the Willow Mission, a fragile lifeline of technology stretched across oceans that were no longer friendly. When she left Kure on March 10, 1944, her 95-man crew was solemn. They had seen too many of their brothers vanish beneath the waves in recent months. Japan's submarine fleet, once proud, had become a graveyard of steel. American hunter-killer groups prowled the shipping lanes, their sonar arrays listening, painting invisible portraits of submarines below. But the I-52's commander, Lieutenant Commander Uno Kameo, was determined. The war demanded that he deliver his cargo, no matter the risk. The Imperial Navy had promised him that once he reached the Atlantic, German U-boats would escort him safely to Lorient, France. It was an audacious plan. A Japanese submarine carrying gold and technology through a gauntlet of American control into the very heart of Allied waters. But by the summer of 1944, audacity was all Japan had left. As I-52 crept through the central Atlantic, the men aboard didn't know that their every movement was being tracked. In Washington, D.C., a small team of codebreakers at OP-20G, the U.S. Navy's Signals Intelligence Branch, had already decrypted Japan's messages to Berlin. They knew I-52's route, her cargo, and her schedule. Her death warrant was already written in ciphertext. At dusk on June 23, 1944, somewhere west of the Cape Verde Islands, she surfaced to charge her batteries. The Atlantic air was heavy, humid, alive with static. Her crew stood quietly under the stars, lighting cigarettes against the wind. They didn't know that hundreds of miles away, a pair of U.S. Navy escort carriers, USS Bogue and USS Croton, were steaming toward them, guided by broken codes and a new weapon that would make submarines obsolete. The American sailors aboard those ships carried a new kind of technology, sonobuoys. Each sonobuoy was a small, floating ear. Dropped from aircraft, it deployed a hydrophone beneath the surface and transmitted the sounds it heard back to the plane above. The ocean, once a place of concealment, was now a stage where every sound could betray a killer. When the first buoys hit the water that night, they sounded like soft raindrops against eternity. Their tiny transmitters whispered in frequencies that only the American Avenger pilots could hear. One of those pilots, Lieutenant Commander Jesse D. Taylor, led the patrol that found her. He was a farm boy from Kansas, more used to the rhythm of wheat fields than sonar signals. But he had become a hunter of submarines, and the Pacific, or rather the Atlantic that night, was his field. Taylor's radar picked up a faint contact, just a blip, but steady, a surfaced submarine. He radioed it in, then began his descent. Beneath him, I-52's crew had no warning. The horizon was calm, the sea indifferent. Then the sky cracked open. Taylor's Avenger dropped flares that turned the night white. For a brief moment, every man aboard I-52 saw the death of their ship reflected in that light. The hum of engines overhead, the whine of a torpedo falling, the impossible realization that they had been found in the middle of the endless sea. 2 acoustic torpedoes screamed into the black. The first missed, the second found her. A flash beneath the surface, a deep rolling thud, the sound of steel collapsing under pressure, and then silence. In that silence, the era of submarine invincibility ended. But this story doesn't end with I-52. Her destruction marked a turning point, the moment Japanese submariners realized that the ocean itself had turned against them. The Americans weren't just hunting them, they were listening, learning, adapting faster than any navy in history. Over the next months, Japanese submarines that tried to slip past the Allied lines began to report strange phenomena. Metallic clicks echoing through the hull, voices from the deep that didn't belong, and sudden detonations that came from nowhere. The sonar buoys, once dismissed as crude, had become the unseen predators of the Pacific. What unnerved the Japanese crews most wasn't that they were being hunted, they were used to that. It was that they couldn't hear the hunters anymore. For generations, submariners had trusted their ears. Sound was their compass, their warning, their only sense of space in the black void below. But the Americans had begun to play with sound itself, bouncing sonar waves off thermal layers, masking destroyers with noise decoys, creating phantom echoes that tricked even the most experienced sonar operators. The Japanese called it the invisible net. To them, it was as if the Americans had thrown an unseen web across the sea, one that caught steel fish no matter how deep they swam. By late 1944, Imperial Navy reports showed entire patrols disappearing without explanation. Submarines sent to reconnoiter the Philippines, the Marianas, even the Indian Ocean, gone, lost without distress calls. Many of them were sunk by aircraft that had no visual contact, only the soft ping of a buoy in the dark. At first, Tokyo believed it was coincidence. Then they intercepted Allied broadcasts, coded signals from aircraft reporting mad contact confirmed. The term stood for magnetic anomaly detection, another new American technology that could sense the faint magnetic field of a submerged submarine. Together with radar, sonar buoys, and depth-finding computers, the Americans had built what one Japanese admiral later called an electronic ocean wall. For the Japanese submariners, it was psychological warfare as much as physical. Veterans who had once cruised freely through the Indian Ocean now refused to surface at night. Others began hearing ghost echoes, convinced that the Americans were listening to their propeller rhythm specifically. Commanders altered speed patterns every few hours, hoping to confuse the enemy's underwater microphones. Crews whispered prayers before diving, convinced that surfacing meant certain death. What the I-52's loss proved was not merely that the Allies could find a single submarine, but that no submarine was safe. The deep, once the ultimate refuge, had become enemy territory. Yet even in despair, there was defiance. Some Japanese captains began ordering experiments of their own. They dragged lengths of metal behind their submarines to create false sound trails. They cut engines and drifted silently through known buoy zones, timing the American responses. A few even surfaced intentionally to fire flares, luring aircraft into traps where Japanese destroyers waited with anti-aircraft guns ready. But the tide had turned. From early 1945 onward, the Japanese submarine fleet ceased to exist as an effective weapon. Out of more than 175 submarines built, 128 were lost. Only a few survived to see the war's end. Among the few survivors were men who had once trained at Kure and Sasebo, men who remembered the first time they heard a sonobuoy's transmission echo through their hull and realized that they were no longer hunters, but prey. By 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard of steel. Beneath its silent waves lay hundreds of submarines, Japanese, American, German, all of them swallowed by the indifferent ocean. Yet no navy suffered as the Imperial Japanese Navy did. What began as a confident arm of stealth and precision ended in fragments scattered from the Marianas to the Indian Ocean. For the men who survived, it wasn't just defeat, it was disbelief. They had watched an art form vanish. Before the Americans turned the ocean into a listening field, the Japanese submarine service prided itself on discipline and precision. Their submarines weren't crude copies of Western designs. Many were innovations, long-range, high-speed vessels capable of carrying aircraft or even midget submarines for special missions. In the early years of the war, these boats struck fear across the Pacific. They had sunk British warships off Singapore, tracked American carriers, and launched daring attacks along the Australian coast. The ocean had been theirs, vast, ungoverned, obedient to skill and silence. Then, the silence betrayed them. The change didn't happen overnight. It began with reports, isolated at first, from crews returning to port with tales that didn't make sense. A commander would describe how, while running silent at 200 feet, he began hearing a faint clicking noise through the hydrophone, followed by rhythmic pulses like distant hammer blows. The sound would fade, then return closer. Moments later, the sea would erupt. Depth charges, accurate and timed with impossible precision. Those who escaped swore the clicks came from nowhere, not a ship, not a propeller. Others said they could hear strange voices over the static, fragments of English words that shouldn't have been possible. What they were hearing were the early sonobuoys. But in 1943 and 1944, Japanese intelligence didn't yet understand how these buoys worked. The ocean had always been seen as a sanctuary defined by invisibility. The deeper you went, the safer you were. The idea that the enemy could scatter floating ears across the water, each one listening and relaying what it heard to an aircraft far above, was too alien to grasp. It was only after a German liaison officer, Oberleutnant zur See Friedrich Steinhauer, arrived in Japan in late 1944 that the truth began to unfold. He brought reports of Allied ASDIC buoys and radiosonic networks, technologies that allowed aircraft to track submerged submarines in real time. Steinhauer was blunt. "You are fighting a war of silence," he said to the Japanese officers gathered in Kurei's briefing room. "But the Americans have found a way to hear silence itself." The Japanese technical officers exchanged uneasy looks. They had already suspected as much. Their engineers from the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal had retrieved fragments of sonobuoys from the waters off Formosa. When they dismantled them, they found simple radio transmitters, a saltwater-activated battery, and a hydrophone dangling below. Primitive, yet deadly effective. The Japanese scientists nicknamed it the Mimizu, meaning the earthworm, because it listened quietly, unseen. But what they didn't know was how many there were. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was dropping thousands of sonobuoys every month across the Pacific and Atlantic combined. They were cheap, light, and disposable. The I-52's demise had proven their worth. The ocean had become a lattice of listening posts, each one linked to aircraft that could strike within minutes. The Americans didn't rely on a single technology. They layered them. First came radar to spot a submarine surfacing for air. Then came magnetic anomaly detection, or MAD, to sense the metallic disturbance caused by a submerged hull. Finally, sonobuoys filled the gaps, scattered by aircraft to trace a fleeing submarine's wake. Together, these formed an invisible triangle of death. Japanese commanders began to realize that their old tactics, slow, silent running, and night surfacing, were suicide. The Americans could hear the shift of a propeller blade, the hiss of a ballast tank, even the faint harmonics of an electric motor. One survivor from the RO-112 later recalled, "We used to joke that the Americans could hear us breathing." By mid-1945, that joke wasn't far from the truth. The U.S. Navy had developed software-based pattern recognition for sonar operators, early analog computers that could differentiate between natural ocean sounds and mechanical ones. The sound of shrimp crackling, the sigh of currents, the groan of whale song, all of these were filtered out until what remained was the hard mechanical rhythm of man-made machinery. No amount of silence could hide it. Japanese engineers tried desperately to counter. They experimented with new hull coatings, rubber sound-dampening tiles, and decoy noisemakers. They even designed special noise emitters, cylinders that, when released, imitated the sound of a submarine engine. But the Americans simply adapted, fine-tuning their sonobuoys to recognize these false echoes. Soon, the Japanese Navy's intelligence section began documenting losses at an alarming rate. In January 1945 alone, 10 submarines vanished. By March, 20 more. The sea had turned against them. In Tokyo, a secret report circulated among the Naval High Command. It was titled "The Acoustic Curtain." The report concluded that Allied forces had effectively built an electronic barrier across the Pacific. "No submarine may pass," it warned. "The enemy's detection network exceeds imagination." But what that report didn't fully capture was the human toll. Inside those submarines, the men were breaking down. Crews developed what American psychiatrists would later call depth charge syndrome, a state of constant anxiety marked by trembling hands, insomnia, and hallucinations of sounds that weren't there. Even when safe, sailors would jolt awake, hearing phantom sonar pings in their dreams. A Japanese petty officer aboard the I-165 wrote in his diary, "The sea talks now. It whispers our names." As the months passed, survival replaced mission. Captains stopped reporting positions. Orders went unacknowledged. The once proud Japanese silence service became a network of ghosts, slipping wordlessly into the abyss. Only a few submarines returned from their missions, and those that did were shadows of their former selves. Their hulls were scarred, their crews hollow-eyed, their engines barely functional. In port, they spoke little. The younger sailors, who had grown up believing the submarine was the perfect weapon, now feared the deep more than the surface. And still, Japan kept building them. Out of desperation, not hope. At Kure Naval Arsenal, engineers worked on experimental submarines, jet-propelled prototypes, super-heavy submersibles, even carriers capable of launching aircraft. But they were too late. The empire was already collapsing, and the ocean that once protected it now delivered its death blow. In April 1945, when the Americans invaded Okinawa, Japanese submarines attempted to intervene. They sank no major ships. Almost every one of them was destroyed before firing a single torpedo. The men aboard those final missions described eerie encounters, hearing sonobuoy clicks miles away, faint mechanical echoes rising from the depths. They knew they were surrounded, yet couldn't see or hear their hunters until the explosions came. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, fewer than 30 of its submarines were still operational. The rest lay in silence, crushed by pressure, rusting on the ocean floor, or burned in their docks. But their story didn't end there. After the war, American divers and salvage teams began recovering wrecks. In 1995, one such expedition located the I-52, still resting nearly 3 miles beneath the Atlantic. Her gold cargo was intact, her hull eerily preserved in the cold dark. Inside, the divers found no survivors, only silence, and a haunting reminder of the night the ocean itself turned hostile. The I-52 became a symbol, not just of loss, but of transition, the moment when war left the surface and entered the invisible world of sound. What the Japanese submariners learned too late was that technology had rewritten the rules of survival. In the deep, silence was no longer safety, it was exposure. And so, the Pacific, vast, ancient, and once free, became the quietest battlefield in human history. Long before the last Japanese submarine slipped beneath the waves, a quiet revolution had begun in the laboratories of the United States. It didn't start with admirals or generals, it began with engineers. Ordinary men in rolled-up sleeves, soldering wires, and listening to static through headphones in windowless rooms. One of them was a man named Dr. Frederick Vinton Hunt, an acoustic specialist from Harvard University. In the late 1930s, Hunt had been experimenting with underwater sound transmission for oceanographic research. His work was meant to study whale migration and seabed mapping, nothing to do with war. But when World War II erupted, the U.S. Navy came knocking. They wanted him to find a way to hear the sea. The first submarine war, during World War I, had already proven that the greatest threat beneath the waves wasn't what you could see, but what you couldn't hear. Back then, Allied ships relied on primitive listening devices, metal horns and hydrophones manned by sailors with good ears. They could sometimes catch the faint hum of a U-boat engine, but by the time they did, it was already too late. Dr. Hunt's task was different. The Navy didn't want better listeners, they wanted automatic ears. Machines that could detect, transmit, and triangulate sound without relying on human reaction time. So Hunt and his colleagues at Bell Labs, Western Electric, and the Naval Research Laboratory began designing what they called the radio sonobuoy, a floating cylinder with a microphone, a radio transmitter, and a battery. Simple enough on paper, but revolutionary in practice. The idea was elegant. An aircraft could drop a cluster of these small buoys into the ocean. Each buoy would listen for underwater sounds, propellers, torpedoes, engines, and send what it heard back to the aircraft above via radio waves. The pilot, listening through headphones, could pinpoint the exact direction and movement of a submarine in real time. By 1942, after a series of frantic wartime tests, the device worked. The first prototypes, codenamed AN-CRT-1, were crude, with limited battery life and short range, but even that small advantage changed everything. When combined with radar and depth charges, the sonobuoy turned anti-submarine warfare from a game of chance into a science. At first, they were deployed in the Atlantic. The German U-boats, once the terror of Allied shipping, began to vanish at alarming rates. Convoy escorts equipped with radar and sonar could now call in aircraft to drop sonobuoys across an area, trapping a submarine like a spider weaving a net of sound. It didn't take long for this technology to move west, toward the Pacific, where Japanese submarines still prowled with confidence. The Japanese Navy underestimated American science. They still believed the U.S. fought wars with industry, not with intellect. But in reality, by 1943, the United States had created one of the most advanced research networks in human history. It was called the National Defense Research Committee, or NDRC, a collaboration of universities, laboratories, and corporations that pooled their best scientists into the war effort. Men like Vannevar Bush, the head of the NDRC, understood something the Axis powers never quite grasped. The future battlefield would belong to engineers. At Bell Labs, technicians worked around the clock perfecting miniature vacuum tubes that could survive saltwater corrosion. At Western Electric, factories that once made telephones began mass-producing sonobuoy components. And at Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory, researchers analyzed hours of recorded propeller noise to teach operators how to distinguish friend from foe. They discovered that every submarine made a unique acoustic fingerprint. The vibration of its screws, the tone of its motors, even the rhythm of its ballast pumps could be recognized, much like a human voice. This meant that a skilled operator could listen to the static-laced transmission from a sonobuoy and say, "That's not one of ours, that's an I-class Japanese submarine." The ocean, once thought to be infinite and chaotic, had suddenly become traceable. To the Japanese submariners who had once felt invisible, it was as though the Americans had learned to see through the dark. In the spring of 1944, the Pacific War was turning. The U.S. had retaken the Marshall Islands and was advancing toward the Marianas. Every mile gained brought the fleet closer to Japan itself, and every new base meant tighter surveillance over the sea lanes. The U.S. Navy's patrol bombing squadrons, or VPBs, began using sonobuoys in greater numbers. These were aircraft crews who flew long, lonely missions over vast stretches of ocean, sometimes for 12 hours or more, hunting for submarines that might never appear. But when they did, the results were devastating. One squadron, VPB 120, flying PB-4Y2 privateers out of Eniwat, logged one of the first confirmed kills using sonobuoys in the Pacific. They had detected faint propeller noises in a pattern that didn't match any Allied vessels. The crew dropped a spread of buoys, forming a rough triangle, and within minutes the signal peaked. The aircraft swooped in and released a cluster of depth charges. When the sea boiled and oil rose to the surface, they knew another unseen predator was gone. For the Americans, it was progress. For the Japanese, it was horror. Soon, reports filtered in of submarines being attacked in regions thought to be safe, hundreds of miles away from any convoy or aircraft carrier. Some captains believed the Americans had spies among them. Others thought the ocean itself was betraying them. What none of them knew was that the Americans had begun Project Jezebel, the precursor to the long-term ocean surveillance system that would define post-war naval power. Under Project Jezebel, scientists studied how sound traveled through layers of water, discovering that deep beneath the surface there existed a narrow sound channel where acoustic waves could travel for thousands of miles without losing energy. It was called the SOFAR channel, a kind of underwater echo corridor. This discovery was monumental. It meant that a sound made by a submarine off the coast of Japan could, in theory, be detected thousands of miles away, even as far as Hawaii if you have the right instruments. The implications were terrifying for any navy that relied on stealth. By mid-1944, the U.S. had begun integrating this acoustic science into operational doctrine. Aircraft could now deploy buoys tuned to specific frequencies that exploited this channel, effectively turning the sea itself into a wire of transmission. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued to rely on outdated tactics and spiritual morale. They believed courage could compensate for technology. But courage didn't bend physics. By the end of 1944, Japanese submarines were dying faster than they could be built. Their missions grew more desperate. Some were ordered to run supplies to garrisons that were already cut off. Doomed. Others were sent on suicide runs, carrying explosive Kaiten torpedoes, human-guided missiles that symbolized both desperation and defiance. The submariners knew they would not return. One of the most haunting accounts came from Ensign Saburo Uchida, a navigator aboard the I-3066. In a letter found after the war, Uchida wrote, "We dive now, not to fight, but to vanish. The ocean is no longer our friend. It listens. It tells our secrets. I wonder if the sea itself wants this war to end." That quiet resignation captured the essence of what had changed. For centuries, sailors had feared storms, sharks, and the crushing dark of the deep, but now the most terrifying sound was mechanical. The faint ping of a sonar buoy echoing through the hull like a death knell. On the American side, the atmosphere was strangely clinical. For the scientists and air crews operating sonobuoys, war had become data. In every mission log, they recorded frequency ranges, decibel levels, and ocean temperature profiles. Each successful attack wasn't just a victory, it was an experiment confirmed. And yet behind the precision, there was awe. Many pilots described the eerie experience of listening through their headphones to the sounds of the ocean, the hum of distant propellers, the chirping of marine life, the crackling of the seabed. It felt almost godlike, they said, to hear a world normally silent to humans. One flight officer later recalled, "It was like holding a stethoscope to the heart of the Pacific." The deeper truth was that the sonobuoy represented more than a weapon. It was a philosophical shift. For the first time in human history, war had entered the invisible domain of sound, mathematics, and vibration. The battlefield had no shape, no borders, no visible enemy, only echoes. And in those echoes, you could hear the birth of the modern age. By August 1945, when Japan finally surrendered, the United States had laid the groundwork for a new kind of global surveillance network. The same acoustic research that had hunted submarines would evolve after the war into the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, a vast array of underwater hydrophones stretching across the Atlantic and Pacific seafloors. Its purpose was to listen endlessly for the hum of enemy submarines, now Soviet ones. But in those early post-war years, the ghosts of the I-52, the RO-112, and dozens of others still haunted the engineers. In the corridors of the Naval Research Laboratory, researchers would replay old sonar buoy recordings to analyze patterns, and occasionally they would stumble on fragments that made them pause. Faint Morse code bursts, unknown engine sounds, clicks that didn't match any known ship or marine animal. The ocean, it seemed, still had its mysteries. And perhaps that's why the men who created the technology never fully celebrated it. For them, the victory had come at a strange cost. They had pierced the last true frontier of human ignorance, the deep, and in doing so, turned it into a battlefield. In the end, the war beneath the waves wasn't won by sailors or submarines, but by scientists with equations and microphones. Dr. Hunt once said, years after the war, when asked if he felt pride in his invention, "Pride, I suppose, but I also think of all the men who went to the bottom because of a few volts of electricity and a good antenna. Science is never innocent." And that was the truest sentence ever spoken about the ocean war. Because once mankind learned to listen to the sea stopped keeping secrets. After the war, the Pacific went quiet. The battleships rusted in harbors, the aircraft carriers turned homeward, and the airfields that once thundered with takeoffs fell silent beneath the weight of tropical vines. The sea, at last, seemed to rest. But in truth, the silence that followed 1945 was not peace, it was listening. The scientists who had built the sonobuoys didn't go home to peaceful retirement. The Navy had new orders for them, classified orders. The war had ended, but a new one was beginning, and this time the enemy wasn't Germany or Japan, it was the Soviet Union. The same laboratories that once designed devices to detect the hum of Japanese engines now focused on something much quieter, Soviet submarines armed with nuclear weapons. And unlike the noisy diesel engines of the wartime subs, these new boats ran on nuclear reactors, producing almost no detectable sound. They could stay underwater for weeks, even months, without surfacing. To track such things, America would need an ear on the ocean floor itself. That's how SOSUS was born, the Sound Surveillance System. It began quietly in 1951, under a veil of secrecy that lasted nearly 30 years. Only a handful of naval officers and engineers knew the full extent of it. The plan was monumental. A web of underwater hydrophones stretched across the seafloor of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, connected by miles of cable to onshore listening stations. The hydrophones would capture the faintest acoustic traces, the distant churn of a submarine's propellers, the rhythmic pulse of its turbines, the subtle noise of its wake. And through that endless listening, the United States would maintain what they called acoustic parity, the power to hear what others tried to hide. In those early years, the operators of SOSUS described their work as listening to the heartbeat of the ocean. They sat in windowless rooms in places like Whidbey Island, Bermuda, and Adak, Alaska, staring at endless reels of spectrograms that translated sound into faint lines on paper. Hours of monotony were interrupted by seconds of revelation. A line might thicken slightly, pulse irregularly, and that was all it took. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a Soviet submarine was moving. The irony was almost poetic. The same technology that had ended the age of Japanese submarine dominance had now birthed the next phase of human rivalry. One fought not with bullets or bombs, but with decibels. Yet, for the men who once fought in the Pacific, the echoes were still fresh. They could look at those new cold warriors, the sonar operators, the acoustic engineers, and see a reflection of themselves, just in a quieter war. They still fought to control the unseen, still relied on sound more than sight, and still measured victory in what they heard, not what they saw. Some of the old veterans from the Pacific campaigns would visit these facilities in the 1950s and 60s. They'd stand behind the younger operators, listening to the faint hum of recordings played over loudspeakers. One of them, a retired Navy pilot who had dropped sonobuoys over the South China Sea in 1944, once said, with a half smile, "We used to listen for death. Now you're listening for the end of the world." He wasn't exaggerating. A single sound, a misidentified echo, or an unexplained noise could have triggered a chain reaction no one could stop. But through it all, there was a strange, unspoken continuity, a thread that connected the war against Japan to the long twilight struggle of the Cold War. The same people who had invented the tools of survival in 1943 had unknowingly invented the instruments of global surveillance in 1953. Every hum, every ping, every whisper beneath the surface had become part of a vast system of vigilance. And still, the ocean never gave up all its secrets. Even with the power of SOSUS, there were mysteries the hydrophones couldn't explain, strange deep-sea sounds that didn't match any known vessel or animal. The operators gave them names: the bloop, Julia, slow down, upsweep. Some speculated they were ice quakes or undersea volcanic events. Others, in hushed tones, wondered if something else lived down there, something vast, older than history itself. Of course, the scientists dismissed the folklore, but the sailors, those who had spent decades staring into black water, weren't so sure. They'd tell stories in mess halls late at night, over coffee and static-filled radios, about the things that didn't show up on sonar, the sounds that vanished as suddenly as they appeared. One retired sonar man once said, "The sea doesn't forget. We may have beaten the Japanese subs, but the ocean remembers what we did. It listens, too." For the men of the wartime generation, that was more than superstition. It was a kind of truth. They had learned that every invention carried a cost. Every advancement came with echoes. The sonobuoy had given them power, yes, but it also transformed the sea forever. The ocean was no longer wild. It was mapped, measured, and monitored. And yet there was something haunting in that knowledge, that the great mystery of the deep, which had terrified sailors for thousands of years, was now reduced to a series of wavelengths on a chart. Still, even as the decades passed, there was pride, too. The veterans of the Pacific could look at the modern sonar arrays and know that their struggle, their desperate, improvised war beneath the waves, had given birth to it all. The scientists who listened to Soviet submarines owed their tools, their understanding, even their language, to those early experiments in the 1940s. Somewhere in a museum in Washington, D.C., one of Dr. Hunt's original AN/CRT-1 sonobuoys sits behind glass, faded, dented, and ordinary-looking. Most visitors pass it by without much thought, but to those who know, it represents something extraordinary, the moment when humanity first truly heard the sea. And if you stand there long enough, reading the little plaque beneath it, you might notice something strange. It looks like a simple metal cylinder about the height of a man's arm. But when you realize what it did, how that humble box of circuits and wires once decided life and death for men on both sides of the Pacific, it hits you. That's the weight of history. That's the sound of a world that learned too much. Somewhere, deep down, the ocean still carries the echoes of propellers and torpedoes, of courage and fear, of victory and loss. It's all there, bouncing endlessly through the water, like ghosts that refuse to fade. And maybe that's how it should be. Because for those who lived it, for those who heard it, silence would be the strangest sound of all. Years passed, and those who had fought in the Pacific began to fade from the decks and cockpits they once commanded. But for many of them, the sounds never left. The deep whine of a turning prop, the hollow ping of radar before a voice cut through, these became part of their memory's architecture. Some of them tried to return to normal life. They became farmers, mechanics, teachers, storekeepers. Others stayed close to the water, taking jobs in the merchant marine or fishing fleets, unable to stray too far from the element that had once defined them. But late at night, when the wind rose or a storm rolled in from the sea, those sounds would return. One of the old sonar operators, years after retiring, wrote in a letter to a friend, "Sometimes when the rain hits the roof in just the right rhythm, I can still hear the sea calling back. It's strange, like it's still talking to me, or maybe asking if I remember." And that was the thing, they did remember. Every man who had fought beneath that endless blue sky or listened to the black silence beneath the surface carried fragments of the war that no monument could capture. It wasn't only about what they'd seen, it was about what they had heard, the tones and pulses that had once separated life from death, the ping of sonar, the click of a detonator, the low, rolling hum of a ship's engines as it tried to sneak through a fogged horizon. Those who had worked on the technology, the scientists, engineers, and communications men, found that peace was no easier. For them, the war had been an equation they'd never stopped solving. Every improvement to sonar, every new frequency or modulation technique carried within it the echoes of that frantic urgency from 1943. We have to hear them before they hear us. And in truth, that sense of urgency never really disappeared. It only evolved. The Cold War turned the ocean into a listening chamber of paranoia. The US and the Soviets each built fleets of submarines that prowled the world's depths, each one trying to remain quieter than the last. And still, somewhere, in concrete bunkers and coastal listening posts, men and women in headphones strained to catch the faintest trace of movement, because somewhere else, others were listening too. But amid all this high-stakes vigilance, something strange began to happen. The scientists who had once built tools for war began using them to understand the natural world instead. The same sonobuoys that once tracked submarines were now being dropped into the water to listen to whales. The same frequency charts that once identified the sound signatures of enemy vessels were now used to map ocean currents and migration patterns. A few of the veterans from the old anti-submarine squadrons took comfort in that. One of them, now in his 70s, said during an interview for a naval documentary, "We used to listen for the sound of war. Now our grandkids are listening for the songs of whales. I think that's how the ocean forgives us, one echo at a time." That line stayed with me, because there's a kind of poetry in it, isn't there? Humanity's first great attempt to hear the ocean wasn't just about warfare or survival. It was about confronting something bigger than ourselves, the vast, unknowable deep that had always been both enemy and mystery. And so even as the men who fought those battles began to disappear, their legacy endured in every sonar buoy that still floats today, in every research vessel that drops its sensors into the abyss. The sea has become a library of sound, not just of ships and storms, but of history itself. You can almost imagine it. Somewhere, a modern hydrophone resting a mile below the surface picks up a faint echo, a ghost of a frequency, too old to belong to anything built today. Maybe it's a remnant of a sonar pulse from 1944, bouncing endlessly through the cold Pacific waters. Maybe it's the echo of a destroyer's propeller, or the whisper of a bomber long vanished. And maybe if the ocean does remember, that's what it remembers. Not the explosions or the chaos, but the human effort to listen, to understand, to survive. Some historians say that the Second World War marked the moment humanity learned to see the world from the sky. But just as truly, it marked the moment we learned to hear it from below. The Pacific War gave us a new kind of vision, one made not of light but of sound. And from that moment on, the sea was never silent again.
There's a small naval museum in Pensacola where an exhibit quietly tells this story. Most people walk past it. It's tucked between more glamorous displays, the fighter planes, the torpedoes, the flight jackets. But if you stop and look, you'll find a little glass case holding a gray, rusted cylinder, a real ANCRT-1 sonobuoy. Next to it, there's a faded black and white photograph of 4 men standing beside their Catalina PBY aircraft, squinting into the sunlight. The caption reads, VPB-94, South Pacific, 1944. No names, no medals, just 4 tired faces. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear what they heard, the faint hum of the engines, the steady ping of sonar, the rush of wind through the open hatch. You can almost feel the tension of waiting for the next sound, the one that would tell them if they'd live to see the next dawn. It's not a loud story. It doesn't shout for attention, but it hums, steady and eternal, just like the ocean it came from. And that, perhaps, is how history really lasts, not in the noise of battle, but in the quiet persistence of memory, in the low, constant echo that refuses to fade long after the guns have fallen silent. Because the truth is, history doesn't end. It reverberates. It moves through time the same way sound moves through water, slowly, powerfully, and forever.
And so, if you ever find yourself near the ocean, take a moment. Listen. Beneath the crash of waves and the hiss of foam, there's another sound, deeper, older, familiar. It's the echo of engines, the distant heartbeat of propellers, the faint song of men who once turned the tide of war by learning to hear. They're still out there, in a way, part of the ocean now. And the sea, as it always does, keeps their memory perfectly.